The CEO ran his finger over the flap of the envelope. It wasn't a pristine, machine-sealed letter like the thousands that crossed his desk every year. There was something undeniably personal about this one. He could feel a slight unevenness under his fingertip, a small ridge where the adhesive hadn't quite set flat. And there, near the corner, a faint smudge, a ghost of a fingerprint where a thumb must have pressed down with too much force. It was a detail most would overlook, but in the sterile, calculated world he inhabited, it stood out like a beacon. Daniel, standing quietly by the window, noticed the CEO's prolonged gaze. His own eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice was steady when he spoke. He sealed it the night he collapsed. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken grief. The CEO looked up, his expression unreadable. Daniel continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a sacred secret. He was writing it while he was short of breath. Mom begged him to rest, to just lie down for a minute. But he shook his head. He said, "No, he needs to hear this. It's important." A sharp intake of breath was the CEO's only reply. The air in the opulent office suddenly felt thin, hard to draw. He looked back at the simple white envelope, no longer just a piece of paper, but a testament. "The tremble you see," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking just slightly, "that little imperfection in the seal, ... That's him. That's him fighting through the pain, fighting for every last breath, just to finish his last message to you." The CEO closed his eyes, the smooth paper cool against his skin. The envelope suddenly felt heavier than any multi-billion-dollar contract he had ever signed, weighted with the final, desperate effort of a dying man. It contained not just words, but the last echo of a heartbeat, the last ounce of a man's strength given freely to him. For a long moment he just stood there, the world outside his soundproof windows fading into an insignificant blur. The constant hum of the city, the endless stream of emails and calls demanding his attention, it all vanished. There was only the envelope, a fragile bridge to a past he had tried so hard to outrun. His empire, built on logic, on ruthless efficiency and the cold, hard language of numbers, suddenly felt like a house of cards. What value did any of it have in the face of this raw human gesture? This final, shaky act of communication. He thought of the man who had sealed it. The man he had once called a mentor, then a rival, and finally, for too many years, nothing at all. He remembered their arguments, the bitter words exchanged in boardrooms, the calculated moves and countermoves that had defined their relationship. He had one, hadn't he? He had reached the pinnacle, the position they had both coveted. He was the CEO, but as he stood there holding this final, trembling message, the victory felt hollow, a bitter ash in his mouth. The man had been gasping for air, his body failing him, and his last thoughts were not of his own suffering, but of him. Of making sure this one last thing was said. What could possibly be so important? An apology? A final piece of advice? A confession? The possibilities swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. He had spent years building walls around his heart, fortifying himself against anything that could be perceived as weakness. Emotion was a liability in his world. And yet this simple, imperfectly sealed envelope had breached all his defenses. It was a Trojan horse delivered not with malice, but with a love so fierce it had defied death itself for a few precious moments. Daniel shifted his weight, the subtle sound pulling the CEO back to the present. He opened his eyes and looked at the young man, seeing for the first time not just the son of his former rival, but the carrier of a profound legacy. Daniel's face was a mixture of sorrow and a strange, quiet strength. He had fulfilled his father's final wish. The rest was up to the man holding the letter. Slowly, deliberately, the CEO turned the envelope over. His own hands, usually so steady as they signed decrees that could change the fate of thousands, were not quite still. He slid his thumb under the flap, feeling the very edge that had been pressed down with such finality. He hesitated. Was he ready for what was inside? Was he ready to face the ghost he had spent a decade trying to forget? The truth was, it didn't matter if he was ready. Some things couldn't be postponed. Some debts had to be paid. With a deep breath that mirrored the one the letter's author had struggled for, he broke the seal. The sound, a soft tear of paper, was deafening in the silence of the room. It was the sound of a wall coming down, of a past that would no longer be ignored. He unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was erratic, a spidery scrawl that sloped downwards, a physical representation of a life fading away. The first line was barely legible, but he could make it out. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a demand, it was just his name. And seeing it, written with such painful effort, felt like a punch to the gut. He began to read, the carefully constructed world he had built for himself finally, irrevocably, beginning to crumble. The last message had been delivered, and nothing would ever be the same again. Thanks for watching.